I wonder if you thought either of these old white men helped themselves with black voters the way they comported themselves and tried to frame this issue last night. And if you can tell us what so-called black jobs are.
Twitter was asking that question last night, so I don't know what black jobs are. I think former President Trump meant that immigration was taking jobs away from black and brown people when he started talking about black and Hispanic jobs. But a lot of people in social media, particularly on X, formerly known as Twitter, took that phrase to be very, very offensive. And so it underscored the problems that Donald Trump has among black voters. So even where he is making marginal gains, perhaps in some of the polling, it's really noisy, so it's really hard to tell. It's actually, you know, I think the general axiom is still true. Black voters who do turn out to vote are going to vote probably overwhelmingly 80% and above for Joe Biden. That being said, Joe Biden didn't have a great night last night. That has to be admitted. And I think the big question coming out of this is not where his strongest supporters go, because they will continue to support him as long as he is the nominee. I think the question is for people who have soft support or for people who are on the fence, did they see anything last night that gave them any confidence in either of these candidates to make them want to show up to vote? And so, you know, if the election were being held tomorrow, the mobilization effort would be very, very difficult. So we'll have to see how this rebounds in the next couple of months, because, you know, I think people are looking at and expecting lower turnout than perhaps we've seen in some recent election cycles, and then wondering whose camp was going to be the least likely to turn out to vote, because that's going to be the side that loses.
Well, and when we consider what will drive people, as you say, to turn out to vote, especially minority voters, is it going to be issue-based? And considering how little in terms of policy substance we were able to actually glean from this debate last night, is anyone likely to have been convinced by any issue these two spoke about at all?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the biggest way that people turn out to vote is because other people ask them to turn out to vote. That's why campaign infrastructure and field operations are so important. And we need to be paying attention to the number of campaign offices that both campaigns are setting up and the number of staff that they're hiring in states to get a sense of the type of outreach that's underway. And you need to count the number of phone calls, the number of doors that are knocked on, the number of mailers that are being sent out. That being said, in terms of issues and mobilization, while a lot of the discussion has focused on the optics of Joe Biden looking lost and stumbling over his words, there was substance there, not just in what was said, but also in what wasn't said. And so if people can kind of take away kind of the visual and actually listen to some of the discussion, they may have learned some things, not maybe as much as they would have wanted to, but they learned something. In particular, when candidates didn't answer questions, when they pivoted, when they deflected, I think that they were sort of betraying a certain lack of preparedness, but they might have also actually been portraying, you know, the fact that they don't care about those particular issues. So if we, you know, look at former President Trump's response to thinking about climate change, to thinking about childcare costs, if you think about trying to decipher what President Biden was trying to say about Medicare, I think that there are things that people can figure out about this, and they may actually be able to figure out with whom they are closest in alignment with on some of these issues.
Of course, you said he beat Medicare, Professor, but I wonder if you can bring us to ground in Georgia. I want to speak locally about Atlanta and Georgia with you for a moment, because, of course, that was the location of this debate by way of CNN being based there. And the spin room featured some familiar faces, including your governor, Kemp, who wouldn't even say that he voted, I guess, for Donald Trump in the primary, chose not to. Can Donald Trump win the state of Georgia? Where are Republicans with him now? Because it looked like an exception for some time.
So, yes, I think Donald Trump can win Georgia. There are natural numerical advantages in the state. We don't register by political party in Georgia, but if we look at public opinion data, if we look at the results of the 2022 election cycle, there's a lot of reason to believe that there are still numerically more Republicans than there are Democrats in the state of Georgia. Now, that gap between Democrats and Republicans has narrowed considerably in the last 20 years. And so what that means is that Democrats can win under certain conditions. When Democrats are running flawless campaigns, when they have a particularly compromised Republican candidate against which to run. So, you know, if you want to talk about executing a perfect campaign, Joe Biden's performance didn't exude flawlessness, but it really is going to come down to the field operations. It's really going to come down to events that are going to happen in the next 4 months before the election to really determine how competitive Democrats are in the state of Georgia. And there are ways that Republicans could squander a victory in the state, but, you know, there is no reason to think that Republicans won't be competitive in the state of Georgia in this election.
A state in which, of course, Donald Trump has been indicted, as have a litany of other defendants in a racketeering case related to 2020 election subversion in the state. He, of course, is also charged in a 2020 election subversion case here in Washington, in which 2 of those charges brought by Jack Smith relate to obstruction. And the Supreme Court today ruling earlier this morning, a January 6th defendant may not be able to be charged with obstruction in that way, calls into question complications around Donald Trump's case. We spoke with Elizabeth Wydra, president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, about this. And then I'd like to ask you about the impact after you take a listen.
It's about the rule of law. It's about whether we have a system that can hold accountable people who have been obstructing not just justice, but obstructing one of the most sacred democratic aspects of our constitutional system, the peaceful transfer of power after the appropriate constitutionally held election.
My question for you, Andra, is after this January 6th ruling today, as we await the court's decision on Donald Trump's immunity in this case on Monday, does any of it actually matter for the average American voter?
I think that the immunity case is going to be more important. That has implications for the start date for the January 6th trial in particular. And I think it also states a question about how, you know, absolute is the executive branch and an executive power that I think is going to be really compelling, and in the right hands could be messaged in a way to say something really important about Donald Trump's candidacy. This particular case could be viewed, you know, as a victory by those who are aligned with Donald Trump. I'm not a legal expert and I still need to read the case, but based on the news coverage that's happened so far, I think the larger question is, if the Supreme Court is saying that merely being disruptive outside of a political hearing is not obstruction of justice, you know, is Donald Trump's role in this case, the alleged the alleged charges in this case, is that the same as just, you know, standing outside of the Capitol and being disruptive and then being arrested for that? And so I think that there may be a way to make that kind of legal distinction that says that he doesn't necessarily benefit from this particular case in the way that some of the people who stormed the Capitol and who were subsequently charged and even convicted in some of these cases were actually implicated.